So I'm not going to go through that again.
Hey,
but that's fine.
YouTube!
So because motion graphics is a subset of animation, we're going to talk briefly just about animation overall. Very specifically, I want to go over the 12 principles of animation, written, developed, if you want to say, by Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas, Disney animators, some of the greats. So there's 12 of them. Not all of them are relevant to motion graphics because some of them are character related. But I'm going to list them off really fast, and then we're going to go one by one quickly so we can move on to the more interesting stuff. So there's squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead or pose to pose, follow through and overlapping action, slow in and slow out, arcs, secondary action, timing, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. So this little animation here demonstrates most of those principles, the ones that apply to motion graphics. No, there's nothing super crazy going on here, right? Ball going up in an arc, landing on the opposite side of the screen. But there's a few key things that are in relation to what I was just talking about. So this first action here, if we break this down, we have our first couple frames, nothing happens, and then our ball starts to squish. And what's happening here is this is signaling to the audience what's about to happen. This is known as squash and stretch. And then this is also a version of anticipation. So anticipating the large move from jumping up and arcing across the screen, our ball is compressing, which is building up its energy, essentially. And then we get the release of this tension as it flies upwards across the screen. And it's hard to tell with the motion blur, so I'm going to turn it off here. But our ball is also not totally circular in these movement frames, which is also squash and stretch. Squash and stretch is probably one of the most important elements of any animation. When things move, they're not rigid objects, so they need to bend and wobble like things do in real life. Pretty much.
What about solid things that don't bend and wobble?
Like floors, if they're large masses.
Like if I was throwing a plate or something like that, could I still apply squash and stretch to something that doesn't squash or stretch in real life?
Because animation in general, while it's mimicking real life, is also about exaggeration. So things that normally don't have properties that we would attribute to them in real life can do so, often for the sake of relaying information to the audience, because it happens so fast in a form that's not totally immediate in frame rate, that is much slower than we see in real life. That is important to still give objects like squash and stretch exaggeration, anticipation. And even on like a very small level, everything compresses and moves. So relaying that to the audience is an important aspect of that. So flying through the air with our motion blur off, we get to this point. Now it's going to be hard to do frame by frame. But if I open up the animation here and just zoom in a bit. So what's happening here is after it reaches its apex, you can see that I've moved a couple of the frames around so that it actually starts ascending faster. This is all about ease in and ease out, as well as arcs. Ease in and ease out just relates to smooth motion between starting and ending. And arcs just generally refers to the fact that things don't move in straight lines. So it follows through. This is also part of follow through, right? If you ever held a golf club or swung a bat and had your dad yell at you to follow through, you know what I mean. It means following through on action. So when something goes up in the air, it slows as it reaches its apex, and then as gravity brings it down, it's moving faster. And then we have squash and stretch as we land. As we land, we compress as we hit the hard object on the floor, and then we uncompress. Now, if I was to continue to work on this, it would probably bounce, or it might roll, or there might be some other follow-through, because having it just land and then literally have any lateral movement when it clearly has a lateral momentum is a little strange, so that would be something you would want to add to this animation in order to make it more appealing. So that's enough of the history lesson and the principles. We're going to move on to doing the things. We're going to go over to Illustrator and we're going to bring up this thing, if I could find it. We're going to get these files from Illustrator into After Effects, where they're all separate different layers that you can control. So I'm going to go fetch the After Effects file.
And those are loaded on.
Yes, I don't know where they are.
Yeah, so every computer except for like one over here and one over here has a folder that has the Illustrator file and an already set up After Effects file. So
If that interests you, if you have your own, the steps are the same.
yeah.
So, oh, hello. Okay. This
Incoming.
is incoming.
Do you have any idea why After Effects switched position to X position, Y position? I just noticed that. And I was like, kind of,
Is it just your copy or
I just checked mine's position. His was. Can you jump back into AE real quick?
That's
Wait,
a
so
serious
go to
change.
the circle.
It's like X up.
X position, Y position.
I unmerged them.
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I thought that was default. I was like,
Nah.
what they do?
I unmerged them so I could have more control. So actually, the version that's probably on the computers probably has this got skipped, but that's fine. So is everyone up to speed here? All right. So normally, I've actually skipped ahead on the file a little bit, but normally all of your art is typically in one layer, or you'll have objects. You typically won't have every piece of art on a separate layer, like there is in this file. So all these pathways have been merged, which is why they say compound path.
What does that mean?
So that means I had previously drawn every single line of this outer shape, and then I used the Pathfinder tool, if you remember from last week, to connect them together, and now they're treated as a single object. So that's what these are. Normally there would all be, actually I could probably cheat and do it right now. I could shove these all into one layer. So this is probably what it looks like before you go to export for After Effects. So what you want to do is you want to go to your layer, select every object in the layer, go to the hamburger. You also have to select it like this as well. Hello. And you go release to layers, sequence question mark?
How do you get that part up?
Yeah, so once you have the layer
Yeah,
selected,
how do you find the,
So, window, probably.
Nick's got it. So you're gonna go release layers to build, and then so build you could see here. Oh, okay. So you could do it either way, but build does it from the bottom up. So whatever's in your background, that's your last layer, and then it goes to the next layer. So you have the most background, and then the next one up, and then and then you have so on and so forth. So your background is on one layer, and your background plus the next object that's closest to the foreground, and so on. So actually I don't want build, because that's not useful to me. I want everything on its own layer. So we're just going to take everything, and we're going to do it in sequence. And that puts every object on its own layer. And then we're going to take all these layers, bring them outside, and then we don't need this layer not that one. Don't need this layer. Maybe we do. It's because I have them. Yeah, the two different types of selects always throw me off in Illustrator. There you go.
And so why do you need this on separate layers?
So the way this works, when we move it to After Effects doesn't know what to do with, actually no, it does know what to do with the objects within shapes. However, if we do that, it'll put everything on one shape layer in After Effects, and you can work like that. But the problem is if you want to apply effects to a layer, you would apply them to every aspect of your shape, because that's how shape layers work in After Effects. So if we wanted to change the color of like the inner triangle here, we would change the color of everything, which is not ideal. So that's why we want them on different layers.
And it also said under one transform node, right?
Yes.
Yeah, like translate, rotate would affect all
Yeah.
the shapes.
You can go into the individual shape and do it. Like, you could go into the individual shape and do everything it said, but in order to apply it to, it's much simpler if you do it, if everything's treated as its own shape. So once that's done, you can save our project here, go back into our After Effects, I'll make a new composition. So right click, or either just this button right here. Once we get to After Effects, it is open.
Let's get that.
No, I mean, for,
Oh, okay.
So we can leave it in 1080-24 for the sake of this, depending on whatever you're using for. Animations is sometimes done in 12. You generally don't see animation much higher than 24 because every frame, you don't need that many frames for animation to work. So it's generally in 24 or 12. So background color, this all looks fine. Make a new comp. So this comp is empty, which is perfect. What we want to do is, it might yell at me because I already have these layers, but that's fine. We're going to want to import some files. You're going to want to go find where that Illustrator file is. Let me get my notes so I do this right. You want to import it as a composition and retain the layer sizes. Oh, this was one thing that I forgot to mention in Illustrator. So generally you're not going to do your artwork in this space, but if you're going to transfer it to After Effects, it's important that you copy whatever artwork you have and put it into this space, because the way it reads the file is, in order to maintain the spacing of the After Effects file, you have to put it in an Illustrator file the way you want it to be spaced. So this is just 1080p preset that I copy and pasted the artwork from a different artboard into. So that's important to note. So that's why, so then when we do composition, retain layer sizes, it'll work the way we want to. You can choose to create a composition if you want. And then, of course, this is an Illustrator file, so I think that's what we want to check. That we'll figure out in a second. No? No. Oh, yeah, that'll create weird, like, folder layers.
That's for if we had a sequence of Illustrator files.
Yes.
Then we'd select
Yeah.
the first image.
Oh,
in
I
the
see what
sequence
it
and
means.
select-
Yeah. So if you have, there are some file formats where you can export in such a way that every frame of a picture or a series of images is a separate file, and that's what this is for. But that's fine. We don't need to do that. So we could choose to create a composition. We don't have to for this. And then if we hit open, it creates one anyway. Why did it do that?
No, it's just yeah.
Okay. I think this worked. Or is this going to yell at me? Wow, that didn't work. Because this is what I had before, right? These ones.
Yeah. Well, it's there, so use that one.
Yeah, it's probably yelling at me because I'm trying to link it from the same places. That would be my best guess. Did it work for everyone else? Okay, so yeah, it's yelling at me because I'm linking to the same file twice in the same After Effects file. So it should pop up with everything in the right place. So it should look something like this. Or now so now everything's yelling at me because I'm linking to the same files. So
Delete that duplicate.
yeah, go away, go away. Well, now it's not matched up at all. That's great. Let's see if I can get around it. No? Okay, so my reference comp is gone, but that's fine. Well, I should make sure it didn't screw with everything else. No, everything's gone now. So I'm going to go ahead and reload.
Try turning it off now.
Yeah. No, do not save, please. Oh, no. Please don't. Oh, no.
Demo back.
Oh, okay, hold on.
Those get moved, just replace, yeah. What? What? Try reload footage, just try reload. Not like it ever works. Hey, it worked this time. What?
Okay.
That's the first time I've ever seen it work, but why did
It's
it?
off
It's all janky.
Everything's janky, but that's...
Yeah, just nudge it back.
I think it's broken for all of it, though. So...
A layer bank? No. Weird.
So things are bad, but that's fine. We'll move on.
Yeah, we'll adjust.
We'll address.
Adapt.
Hopefully, I already did export to that intro, so hopefully that's not too bad. So, where are we? Where are we? That's a good question. Okay, so hopefully we're here, and hopefully it's imported correctly for.
I mean, mine was, if you open just the After Effects file and you have the Illustrator file downloaded.
Yeah, Nick, I might need
reference
that
comps are
Illustrator
all
file
fine.
back.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to take the Illustrator file off of these machines to get it back.
Okay, that's
Cause mine.
So,
Or just, if you jump on the
Oh,
slide
you know what
to
it
get
is?
Or,
You know what it is? It's because I saved that Illustrator file.
exactly, you saved
it's
it
on
with
the
modification.
desktop.
So I wonder if.
We saved over it, just download it again, or,
It's on the desktop.
oh, but did he saved over it?
So hold on. Don't save this.
still open.
Yeah, but he saved.
No, I saved over this Illustrator file. I
But
need
it's
the
still
other
open.
one.
Can you undo and save it again?
Sure. Go back down.
So this is what it looks like when I was in the.
Okay. Try saving
Save
it now.
this.
Everything's fine.
We're working this out. This is
It's gonna turn into
classic troubleshooting.
troubleshooting.
Oh,
No.
okay.
Okay, so that I think that's happening because you're doing retained layer sizes. That just happened to Chanel over here.
Did it?
Yeah.
So if you do it without retaining the layer size, it'll come in okay.
This is me just trying to reload footage, but okay, we'll try it. Well, I can't do it. Because if I delete these files now, they'll disappear from
You
Spotify.
deleted the actual file.
Okay, what's the fastest way to airdrop?
Where is the file on the machine?
On your desktop.
Don't save this. Get this out of my face.
Right there.
This would be impressive if this one was broken.
That would be fine.
Yeah.
Come on.
Hey.
We're back.
All right. So we're back. Back again. All right. So let's actually move into After Effects.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Woo!
So all your cops should look like this, pretty much. So what we want to do first, which I didn't do in a couple of my other ones, but do what I say, not what as I do, is we want to select all our After Effects layers, and then we want to create, and we want to create shapes from vector layers. And what this is going to do is it's going to take our After Effects layers and translate them into shape layers, which is the native vector art for After Effects. So nothing should change visually on your screen, but you'll now have 3 more layers with the same names pretty much as the source file that they came from, except now they're called outlines. So you want to animate these. How do you go about it? So shape layers are a little strange in After Effects The way they work is that they have contents, which are shapes, which include shapes. So this one is our outer ring here. It includes a group, which includes a path, which includes a stroke. So there's a line that's being traced on the screen, and then the stroke is the white, essentially, that we see on the screen. And then it also has its own values for its anchor point, position, scale, skew, rotation, and opacity. So going over all these quickly, the anchor point is the point within the shape. Actually, I want to talk about this in terms of the shape layer itself, because that one's easier to understand. So the anchor point is the point within the screen that any changes I make to this object will relate to, which will make more sense as I explain.
It's like, where's the length there?
Yeah, so it's not popping up. Where's the
Just the pan binding tool. Y. No. And just click on toggle mask path shape
To
visibility.
the right of that.
Just
yeah,
to the
right here. Here it is. I know it's there somewhere.
Yeah.
So here we go. So you can see all the points here, and then this here in the center is our anchor point. So if I decide to do what Nick suggests and rotate this object, it rotates around the anchor point. If I take what Brad suggested and I go to the pan behind tool and I move this anchor point elsewhere, and then I decide to rotate it, it rotates around that. So that's what the anchor point does. Put that back in the center. Position is pretty self-evident. It's the position on the screen. You have your X and your Y, which you can split at some point, but we don't need to get into that. Scale, same thing. Your X and Y, they're bound together, but you can unbind them. So I could scale just the Y and just the X. Rotation, also pretty self-evident. 0 to 360. You can also go negative. The second number is rotations, which is useful for when you animate, so you don't have to do multiplications of 360 to figure out how far it should spin. And then opacity is your alpha channel, also pretty self-evident. Whether it's blended into whatever the background is, or if it's completely opaque. So those are the basic properties of pretty much any shape layer you'll come across. And then there was one more. So that's the shape layer, but then the shape within the shape layer also has a few more. Skew, which is this, and then the axis for the skew. So if you really want to warp something, skew is the way to go about it. So there is one other thing I want to just quickly touch on while we're in shape layers. So if we go to effects and presets, and we go to our animation presets, if we go to shapes, and then we go to stills, it has a bunch of shapes in here already.
Side daisy.
So normally the way you make shapes is through this tool up here. You won't have anything selected, and then you create a shape like that. And you can see as soon as I started drawing and made a shape layer. There's not a lot of options here, and if you want to make more complex things, you generally want to go through Illustrator, but there's also a few presets that are pretty typical for any sort of normal shapes you can make. So half shapes, crosshairs, gears, yeah.
Violent socialist macron.
So plenty of other options within shapes.
Yeah.
Wait,
Do you wanna,
Yeah,
show
let's see
double
what
click
Seaside Daisy is.
Where is that?
bottom?
you listen
Nice.
to. Can you do Mandela? Mandala?
All right, I'm not going to let these people derail this, so I'm going to move
Holy
on.
lights.
Makes the
I
shape
swear to God, if you-
Oh, yeah.
You know what?
Just like-
So
Myself.
one thing that, what are you trying to get at?
The shape tool up top, I think if you double click it, Yeah, it'll make
Oh.
the shape, the size of the composition.
So,
Right.
oh yeah, it makes its shape. I thought this was a solid.
What color is that?
Yeah.
You can also right click, transform
Really?
fit to color.
Aw, that's so cute.
Transform.
No, I'm kidding. It's
Dude.
Is it?
It made a very large
Like
rectangle.
scale to top.
Oh, like the what's
Like if
going
this
on
was
in
a
the
little
layer.
bigger, if this was a little bigger, would it have shrunk it a little bit to the M position? Oh my god.
Well, and also it would snap the proportions.
Animation.
Yeah, right. I know. It's
That's
like
right.
those little features.
Shapes.
Once
So-
you learn them.
Those are all the properties, and now we're going to change those properties so it actually does
Nikki,
something.
ready?
So the way pretty much animation works in any program, anywhere, is this little thing over here. It's the time stop, the stopwatch. You turn this on, and then you get this little thing. This is called the keyframe. And you can see I can add keyframes as I move along the playhead to different portions in the timeline. And this is essentially the mathematical way that the computer understands when values are changing and how to change them. So I won't animate the anchor point because that's obnoxious. I will animate, let's just do rotation instead. So rotation starts at a 0, 0 with 0 rotations. And then I could say 1 second in, add another keyframe, and then say be rotated 90 degrees, 89 degrees. And then I could go on here. And the nice thing about the After Effects is if, well, no, it's a double-edged sword. If you have the stopwatch on, you could just make a change to this layer. You don't have to go over here and add a keyframe. It'll add one automatically, which is great for workflow, but it's awful when you change something when you don't realize it. So now if I play this over the next 2 seconds, it'll rotate. And because it's pretty uniform, I could so you see the difference more abruptly.
There we go. Here we go.
There you go. So that's pretty much what keyframes are. Oh, and one other thing while I'm here. Yeah, motion blur. We'll get to motion blur in a second. But keyframes, so you could tell that the motion, it starts pretty abruptly, and then after 2 seconds, it stops pretty abruptly. Now, this doesn't conform with what the principles of animation want us to do, which is smooth in and smooth out. So the easiest way to do that with keyframes is to select whatever keyframes you want to ease, and you're going to hit F9, or is it different on
Function
It's function
Yeah,
F9.
Yeah, it's like a shift.
That was
Oh
option.
no, it's bringing up
Oh.
system prefs. Yeah, just right click it.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Everybody's gonna right click.
Everyone's going to right click it anyway. So it gives us a bunch of different options to do with the keyframes, but what we want is this easy ease, F9. So now when we play it, you'll see it starts up, it eases into rotating, and then it'll ease out of rotating. Much nicer. Much smoother, much more visually appealing to watch, and it fits with both easy ease and the arcs. Like nothing moves super linearly. Everything has acceleration in real life. Nothing just is moving and then stops moving. So that feels much more real. So
Show them the motion.
let's do the motion blur while we're here. Motion blur. So I'm just going to redo all that so I have something that's actually moving. So anyone know what motion blur is in the context of video and why we have it? One of you two, fight over it.
Everybody's-
Shimmy.
Boy. Okay, anyway, so motion blur is when something moves and it's blurry.
Oh, thank you.
And
Nick, do you have a better idea?
no, I was getting to it, Nick. Jumped the gun. So the reason we have it in video and film is because when let's say your hand in front of your face moves like that, you don't see it perfectly crisp the whole time. It's blurry, so it gives you a headache if you don't have motion blur.
Yeah, so pretty much in in the real life, where our frame rate is who knows how much. I think it's like 100 frames per second or something like that. Even things can move faster than that. So our brain doesn't see objects the whole time. It's not focusing in super crisp realism every frame. So our brain fills in the gaps when things move super fast. Computers don't do that automatically. Computers will make you sit there and watch everything happen in perfect resolution, which is super disorienting for our brains because that's not how our brains work. So we use motion blur to simulate that same effect. So we want to enable motion blur for the layer, and then what we have to do is enable motion blur for the composition. This is here because motion blur will make your machine cry and drain battery infinitely in an infinitely small amount of time. So it's super intensive on CPU, software, and processing power. So generally, you'll pick which layers want motion blur, and then you'll move on, and then you'll come back to enabling motion blur for the whole comp when you want to see a more final product. Because having it on all the time would grind your machine to a halt. So if we play it with motion blur, now this object is mostly just stroke and line. So motion blur, depending on how fast it moves, will actually look pretty weird. If I like really ramp up the speed on this, like if I just have it do like 50 rotations.
Oh wow!
Oh, that's cool. Okay.
So if I do motion, so without motion
Oh,
blur,
the computer just catches on fire.
without motion blur, this is what it looks like. And if I try to play it like this won't make any sense to your brain essentially. Like nothing, like that doesn't make sense.
Clockwise or
We can't see
counterclockwise?
fast enough. It just, the frame rate's too low. It can't process that much. But with motion blur, this is probably more accurate to what we'd see if something was moving like this.
So we wouldn't see it.
Exactly. So we wouldn't.
It's
So
like it reminds me of Vertigo.
yeah, exactly. So motion blur
Good.
is good and bad. It's pretty much the moral of the story.
You have to use it, but
We are going to do one other thing that's similar to motion blur. We can actually just touch on that right now while we're here. So motion blur is generally the way you go about creating that sort of blur effect that we simulate in real life, but there's another way to do it. I'm going to disable the motion blur and make something less drastic here. If we go over here to our effects and presets and we punch in echo, and actually I'm going to move over to one of my other comps here so I don't have to go through the steps right now. There's this sort of effect.
wait, what?
So there's no motion blur on this comp. I could turn it off and it would be the same. None of these layers have motion blur.
Bullshit.
So pretty much what's happening here, if I want to, if I could find, so I've applied this echo to this layer. If I can isolate this layer.
The shape one.
So I've cheated here. I'm still working on the After Effects files, but it would be the same for a shape layer.
Where are you using the effect controls? Are they the same on the top as they are down there?
Yes, so the things over here, it says effects control, but if I go into the layer itself, I could find all this information right here. It's pretty much, that's why when I select it here, it shows up selected up here as well. So if I just make this so you can see a little bit, if we zoom in, that's a little far, but you get the idea. So this is an actual blur, but this is creating a bunch of copies in echo in the wake of this image, which gives it the effect of blur. Yeah. So
Do you want to, why?
Actually, it's using some.
Why can I not just use echo instead of motion blur all the time?
you can use echo because of motion blur all the time, because motion blur works both ways. So things appear slightly in front of itself and things appear slightly behind itself. An echo will never do that, pretty much. You can't have an echo that's ahead of something and behind something. You can't have an echo that's in front of something ever, really. So echo is generally for motion graphics only. You're never going to want to do echo if you want something photoreal, or if you're trying to accomplish a realistic effect.
Did
The-
they do the Flash?
Hmm?
Where they do the Flash guy running?
That's like an application.
Really putting me on the stand here.
They put an
You have to ask them, Shaya.
What happens if you put does the echo time go above 0?
The echo does go above 0.
So is that the future
wanna
echo?
see-
That is the future
Alien
echo.
face?
So if I, you can see the echo is really small, by the way. There you go,
Yeah,
future
nice.
echo.
So what if you did,
So if you did a duplicate of
and
it,
then the inverse, what did you say exactly?
Yeah, it would work, but it would be massive.
yeah,
um,
but you could do
you
it.
could reduce the number of echoes, and I feel like you could get there.
What would that happen? Would it just be like projecting itself in between the 2 points that you made? Basically?
Yeah, essentially the true object would be between the future echo and the echo
Which
echo.
is a cool animation.
Yeah.
Like going towards you.
Nice. Whoa, it's cool.
So
Like a
that's a
subtly
future
different
echo.
effect, but yeah, cool.
And there's a bunch of different tinkering you could do with it. So you could change the starting intensity of it, which is how bright it is in the beginning, in relation to the object itself. Excuse me, my voice is going. The decay, which is, so you can see that these are sort of more translucent than the ones that are first created. So we could just make them all the same.
Oh, that's cool.
So there's that.
Oh, nice.
We could give them negative decay as well, essentially, so that they stay around longer. The number of echoes, that's pretty self-explanatory, and echo time is also pretty self-explanatory.
Definitely.
What happens if you put motion blur on echo?
Pretty much what you expect. It is motion blur,
Yeah.
so it does,
It's a leading edge.
it blunts it even more. So yeah, gives it a real, yeah. This is, by the way, this is something that's important for motion graphics. You can see here that the machine is playing at default half resolution. So even though this is vector art, it's going to appear slightly pixelated in certain spots because of that. If you want to not do that, you just put default. It does make your machine crunch harder though.
So what if I have my resolution set to full and I know I'm using vector graphics, but it's still all crunchy and pixely when I scale it up?
Because, Brad, the viewer, the way Adobe After Effects works is its viewer doesn't.
What's the fix? That's,
Yeah, what?
That's
How do you
amazing.
fix it? What's the little sun thing for?
Oh, okay.
yeah.
So this is called continuous rasterization. Technically, Adobe After Effects doesn't use vector graphics. It uses raster graphics, but it can interpret vector graphics through a series of raster graphics. If that makes any sort of sense.
Well, because you have a set resolution for your columns,
Yeah.
so you're only going to be seeing that resolution.
Exactly.
Another thing to point out is right next to the sun, there's that line that went straight. When I first downloaded After Effects, default, that was all like blocky, and I couldn't get continuous rasterization to work. So if you click that, it'll do it again.
It's a quality
Do it
setting.
again.
And then that's draft
So that'll
quality.
look gross.
It's hard to tell because this object has so little detail.
It wouldn't affect export though, would it?
I have no clue.
Yeah, I think it does because that's what controls like the frame blending quality too.
Interesting.
So it's important that these are ticked on when you're dealing with vector. Now,
There's some of those examples. Show the
sure.
what'd you do? Make it cool.
So I just went through a couple of things using all the tools we've talked about. This one you've already seen. This is using echo with them. Let's turn off the motion blur. Straight echo. And if I actually turn on all the
So where's
layers,
the other pieces?
they're all there. Don't worry.
Nice.
So, and if you select your window screen and then you hit the tilde key, that will get to full screen. Tilde will full screen any screen
In any Adobe product.
in any Adobe products.
Why can't we control?
Yes, Shayna.
This?
Did you copy and paste the same echo on all of them, or did you have to change it for a smaller object?
I believe the inner object is the same. If I find that echo, yes. But this the center object is smaller, so I think I have less echoes on it. Or no, the echo time is greater on this inner object. And there are less echoes. Just because there's not enough space for echoes to not look like a massive white object in the center of the screen. So size matters. Moving on.
A 4 out of 10.
This is pretty simple. This is using a motion blur. And you can see what I was talking about earlier, where motion blur with very thin objects creates this weird transparency effect. When they're moving into frame, they're not the same white color that you'd expect them to be, like you see in the echo, just because of the way they're moving and the way motion blur works. If I just turn it off real fast, you could see it's pretty disorienting. It'll definitely give you a headache if you stare at it long enough. And that was just some scale and some rotation changes. So there's no position changes in this one. You can see all of these are easy eased to give it a smoother motion. And all of these are sort of offset from one another so that we have sort of what's referred to as secondary action. Secondary action is when your principal action is being animated, but there's also some other element to the animation that people are looking at or that's possessed of the object to give it more interesting qualities to look at, and it feels more engaging than if just one thing was moving at one time and then another thing moves and then another thing moves. So that's just some quick motion blur. This object, this composition, we haven't actually touched on the properties of this composition, but I'll just play it really fast. So this you could achieve in 2D, but I wouldn't recommend it. These objects have been transformed into 3D layers. So that's what this cube is right here. It creates a 3D layer, and then pretty much it's the same as everything was before, except now there's a third object towards a third parameter for every object, which is your z, which is your depth. So in this case, I actually haven't animated the depth of these objects, but in order for it to spin on the y-axis such that it spins around itself, you have to put it into 3D, which is what has been done here. So, and you can see there's also motion blur on this as well. If I turn off the motion blur, this will also give you a headache.
Yay.
So, X, Y, and Z rotation. You have a
Oh yeah, Canadians.
Yeah.
I was like, British.
you have the depth position, which looks like scale when you're looking at it from the front. But if, I don't know how this is going to look, but you could change the camera. So for 3D compositions, if you want to look at something from the top, you can. These are 2D, so they have no depth, so there's nothing. But if I give it, no, there's no depth in the first place in scale.
Just don't.
So-
If you do a custom view, and then just use the C tool, the camera tool, you can rotate around.
So pretty much what Nico said.
Yeah. There you go.
We're in 3D space.
So that's what the view was I was before. This is what I was looking at, which is why I didn't see anything. But now, so you can see in every sort of, and if we play it from a certain angle, just like Maya.
Just like
So yeah. Anything else I super wanted to touch on? now we can move on. So this is what I came up with for Park Post's demo reels. Our intro is outdated. I believe it has text and it has the year on it, so we need a new one. So I took it upon myself to do that. Nothing super fancy, but it's pretty elegant. I think it turned out all right.
Ooh.
This is, for those of you
No,
who don't
that's
know,
for sound design week.
this is an alpha channel. So this is a black solid. Unlike the rest of these projects, these compositions, which I've just been working on the alpha, but the alpha is viewed to be grayed out. There is an actual solid that is a black layer, and then this alpha channel is, when you zoom in here, this will be whatever video is playing to start the reel. So there's a couple other things I did with this that I haven't touched on, so we'll go over that really quickly. And you can see the principles of animation. So throughout this composition, just a little bit of nudge there as a follow through. It's pretty hard to tell, but it's subtle. A lot of the stuff I talked about with the principles is not something that's so overt that you notice it all the time, but it's important details that go into animation to make it feel a certain way. So even here, wow, it's going to yell at me because I'm zoomed in. But you can see when this arrow lands, it follows through just a little bit, very subtly, but that sort of thing is important. So if we go, just zoom back out. So this effect with the drawing is accomplished through, if I could find the layer. This is the layer. So within all your contents, is this the layer? No. Is it? It is, okay. Within all your contents, there's this little button here that says add, and that gives you a bunch of different things to do. These are all properties that you can animate within After Effects. So in the case of this animation here, I animated the path such that it's a trim path, which pretty much means the actual, this purple line is the path, the white is the stroke that you see. So it's being, from start to finish, this is where the path starts up here. And then it moves around the predetermined path through animations of the end. So over here, when the end is at 100% and the start is at 100%, they're both in the same spot, so there's nothing there. Yes, Nick?
Similar to when we did the drawing or they're doing their dances,
Yes.
we're doing the path. It's like that, but you keep the path the whole time instead of following.
Yes, exactly. So, and that's just animated to go from 100% to 0%. So that is one. Yes.
Did you have to animate your play button thingy by hand to follow?
Yes. So if I go find this thing, you could see all of my keyframes for the arrow. You can see they're all sort of on the inside because if I go zoom in, nope.
No, I'm trying.
It's pretty difficult to tell, but you can see the center point I put on the very edge of the arrow, just so that I could have an easy way of tracking its position in relationship to the line.
Take the end of the animated trim path end value. I don't know if there would be a way to tie it.
I don't think
No.
because it's not a path.
Yeah,
right?
and they don't have a
Tie
follow.
the object to
Yeah,
that path.
exactly. They don't have a. They have an object follow path effect in it. I don't think so.
You can draw a path.
Yeah, but
I
you
just
can't
don't
have an
know if you
object
turn-
follow the path.
I I don't know.
Go to the little.
Because you can do that in my.
Well, they go beaver away at that.
Look it up. I'll find it. Yeah,
Uh,
there's 300 points for sure.
So yeah, I had to hand animate that. The other thing I did in order to accomplish, well, there's a lot of stuff that's going on here. That's just a scale out from the middle object. That's scale. And then in order to accomplish this move, where everything is moving at the same speed, I use something called a null object. Now, null objects are exactly what they sound. They are objects that have no properties. But you can give them properties, and then you can parent other objects to that null object, and then they will all follow that null object's properties. So you can see over here, parent and link, all of my layers have been parented to null2, which is the name of the null that I've used. And the null shows up as this red square with the center in the center of the screen at the top left of the cube. So through a simple transform of scale from 100 to like 7,000, simple. The whole, I can animate, rather than having to go through every layer and find out the time it takes for an object of its size to scale proportionally to every other layer's size and scale, I could just bump them all together with this null object, which is super useful for moving things together.
And for if you need like the anchor point being a very important part of the rotation of the animation, having the ability to have multiple nested anchor points is a nice use of
Exactly.
null objects.
Can you go back and rotate it like a few degrees and then show how it affects everything with the whole animation?
Sure.
Just
So
for clarity.
just as a more direct frame of reference, if we find rotation, you can see that all of my layers are moving together.
You can make it like the Batman scene transition.
Yeah. The one other major thing I did was to get this alpha map to work. I have to create a shape. So you can see this blue shape here. This blue shape you never see in the final composition. It's being used as something called an alpha mat. So who knows what a mat is and wants to explain it? Who knows what a mat is? You want to take a stab?
I was gonna say, you're able to put like another image over the mat. That's what it's used for.
Yeah, that's close. A mat is essentially a shape that's used as a mask. Yes? Or do you want to elaborate more on that?
Cut a hole.
Yeah, it's meant to cut a hole, essentially. So rather than draw a mask, because the way masks work in After Effects is that they're tied to the parent properties on their layer, and in this case I wanted to make sure that that wasn't the case. I wanted to tie it to the null object. I created this alpha mat shape, which is a triangle that's pretty much the same size of the inner triangle, if I could find it. Where's my inner triangle? So it fills up the whole space of the inner triangle. And then I've changed its mode. So if I make it no longer visible, it will create alpha. But I've changed its mode. If I go to switch toggles and modes here, the black layer that I've been using as my background, I've made it an alpha inverted mat. So pretty much, if I switch it to an alpha mat, so you can see, the shape I made will only, the black background, the black solid will only appear in the shape I've made. Alpha inverted is just the opposite. It'll appear everywhere where the shape has not been made. There's also versions of this for Luma, but that's not terribly common with motion graphics and that sort of thing. So
It always references the layer above it, right?
yes, so you can see here, if I take this, you can see here that this first means that it's being property, like it's being affected by a map, and then this is telling you, hey, this is the map for this layer. That's what these two shapes are. Like if I move this around, it probably won't do much because it'll look pretty strange. There you go. It won't do anything because none of these other shapes have fill, so there's no property for it to fill in for alpha. So that's how this alpha in the middle here is accomplished. And yeah, that's pretty much everything I had. Oh, there was one other thing in the other project file I could bring up really fast. I have to go fetch it though. That is not related to the logo. If I close this, don't save. Go find this one. So we've been talking a lot about moving objects, but just real briefly here at the end, a little something about shape layers themselves. So we've been talking about you can add forms to animate them, but we can also add a whole lot of properties to them. So if we right click and we go to or maybe it's in contents. This is what I get for tacking things on at the end.
What are you trying to show?
Okay, so layer styles and blending modes are super useful to achieve certain effects. So this sort of textured effect is accomplished through a layer style, through bevel and boss. And then I've taken the bevel and boss and I've made them dissolve and I've changed their color. So you get this really nice texture on the object, but there's like a lot of stuff here that you could play around with. So you don't just have solid colored shapes in your motion graphics. So you could give them a little personality, a little depth, something to catch the eye. And there's a lot of stuff there to mess around with. You can also apply effects to them as well. There's a lot, so you could give it like an image. Which one? This one.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. There's no, yeah. Looks more interesting if it was on a black solid. So yeah, that's pretty much the last thing I want to touch on. And that's intro to motion graphics.
Does anyone have something that they were trying to do with their personal logo?
I just have like a general
How do I
question.
stop? Yes.
The line that you made for that circle,
Yeah, like
whatever,
a little
to move in like a straight